Welcome, everyone. We've got 25 participants in the room right now and a few more being added. So we'll give a few minutes here before we get started. I think one of the features we're going to have in the future while we're waiting, the 2 minutes is I'm going to get some elevator music in here so we avoid the quiet time.
Someone found that funny.
Was that a funny face or was it a crying
And
face? I'm
that
not
was
sure.
not
Okay, we've got 57 participants in the room now. There's always going to be others that will come in a few minutes later, but why don't we get started? We've got a pretty full agenda ahead of us. Welcome everyone to our webinar on Canada's Modern Slavery Act, Practical Insights and Lessons Learned from Year One. My name is Alan Toe, and I'm the CEO and President of Supply Chain Canada West. I want to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded, and what we'll do is make this recording available to all registered participants 30 days for 30 days following the event. So what we'll do is we'll send you an email after this event with a link to the video, as well as we're going to be sharing a copy of this presentation with you. And in the event that we don't answer all of the questions, we'll provide you with a FAQ out to all participants as well. As it relates to questions, I encourage and invite everyone to go to the Q&A, use the Q&A functionality in Zoom and post all of your questions there. We will do our best to go and answer those questions at the end. And again, if we don't answer your questions, we'll get to them in our email response afterwards. So just quickly, Supply Chain Canada, for those that don't know about our organization, is Canada's largest association for supply chain professionals, and we operate across coast to coast to coast. Our members move about $1 trillion worth of goods on an annual basis, and there are over 900,000 workers employed in Canada's supply chain. Our sole purpose of being is to strengthen Canada's supply chain. And consistent with our purpose to strengthen Canada's supply chain and to advocate for these best practices in supply chain, we're really pleased to give an update today on S211, Canada's Modern Slavery Act, also known as the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act. So this is an act that is aimed at addressing and mitigating the presence of forced and child labors within supply chains. And as a progressive and responsible economy, I believe that this act is crucial in protecting human rights, ensuring ethical business practices, complying with legal standards, and then promoting social and economic development while also meeting our customers' demand for ethical products. For today's webinar, we've got a number of items that we're going to go through. Like I said, a really, really jam-packed agenda. We're going to start off with some lessons learned from year one. So what have we heard and learned from both members and clients in this space after their first report? And then we're going to move on to providing you with insights on how companies are approaching the design of their governance framework to incorporate modern slavery considerations. Next, we're going to discuss strategies for conducting successful and efficient global supply chain risk assessments and also provide a look into what is the potential for this act, what's going to happen next, and do we sort of see how this act will change over time into the future. And then finally, we're going to sort of wrap everything up and share the value of training and also provide you with additional resources for support. Okay, why don't I move on and just introduce our speaker. So super rich agenda, and I'm really happy to share this webinar with our esteemed presenters today. So joining us today are the two founders of Shift Critical International, a thought partner to Supply Chain Canada in the space of sustainability. Frank McShane has over 25 years of experience with major resource companies, defining strategic solutions to sustainability and ESG challenges. He has a doctorate from McGill University, and he has been a leading voice in helping corporate teams on governance and ethical compliance, government and community relations, and sustainability strategy design. Craig Steinhaus is the co-founder of is also a co-founder of Shift Critical, and also has had tremendous depth and expertise in the sustainability space. As a champion for sustainability performance, Craig has been awarded the Excellence in Corporate Responsibility Award in recognition of his long leadership for transforming businesses towards a sustainable future. We're also very fortunate to have Carmen Turner join us today as well. Carmen also brings tremendous experience in corporate sustainability and has spent over 13 years at Tech Resources in BC, where she has led the development of Tech's sustainability program from the ground up. And as a founder of Carmen Turner Sustainability, Carmen supports companies to adapt emerging disclosure regulations and to implement ESG practices. Frank, Craig, and Carmen, welcome and thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. At this point in time, I'll pass the presentation over to Craig to provide us the year one look back and lessons learned. Craig.
Thanks very much, Alan, and welcome everybody. My name is Craig Stenhouse. That was a great introduction. We should probably stop there. Sounded pretty impressive. The tagline that we use at Shift Critical is "Shift happens," and it's kind of a play on words, but it's important and significant to what we're talking about today. And I'm just going to quickly introduce what we do. Frank is my partner, and he can speak a bit to this a bit further on in the webinar. But between the two of us, we certainly have decades of experience. And I'm not going to, my style is not to read the bullet points. I'll do my best to speak around them and rely on you to read them. But what I would leave you on this slide, and it's not to be arrogant, but there isn't anything in the sustainability spectrum that Frank and I have not done. And we're working on scope 3 emissions. We're working on scenario planning. We're working on ESG strategy. We're working on human rights assessments. It just so happens that the two of us are experts at human rights risk assessment, and I've conducted dozens in my career since the early 2000s and feel like a kid in a candy shop because this is exactly what we've been working on for the last 25 years, both Frank and I. So if we take a look back at what we learned working with Shift Critical, we've gained quite a few clients over the last 8 to 10 months in particular. We're working with just over 20 right now on a number of different things involving supply chain risk assessment, supply chain training, supply chain governance work. And what we've learned is that Canada is indeed one of the most stringent jurisdictions in the world. And it's part of this global trend that we're seeing on how governments are introducing measures to combat modern slavery, and in Canada in particular, forced labor and child labor. Now, it's difficult to compare jurisdictions, but we're very similar to the UK, Australia, and California, where there's a focus on transparency and disclosure. If you look into Germany and France, there's requirements to actually conduct due diligence. And Frank will get into this a bit later and where we see it going, but why is Canada different? There's really a few different reasons why. It's more stringent with respect to penalties for non-compliance. We have broader adaptability across different types of entities that the government has come out with, a unique reporting format that incorporates a questionnaire, and then also explicit mention of director responsibility. So in the grand scheme of things, we're one of the most stringent jurisdictions, probably up there with Australia, in the globe. And it's, in our opinion, which Frank will get to, we think it's just going to get more stringent. So maybe some challenges faced, and I'm just speaking from our perspective working with clients, particularly over the last 6 months. One thing that we found working with clients, it's really important to do what makes sense for your client. for your own company. We did have a conversation with the core buds person who's responsible for overseeing the modern slavery files and investigation process. Their perspective is you need to look at 100% of your suppliers. That's not our approach. We may get there eventually with respect to the legislation, but if it makes sense for your company and the resources that you have, take a look at a percentage of spend. Take a look at spend over $1 million, below $500,000. What's important is that you have a methodology that you can use in your report, because report that matters in this legislation, and the risk assessment drives the reporting. And we'll get to what Shift Critical does with our clients on the risk assessment side, but it's really about identifying the risk indicators that make sense for your company. One other element that we've really gained to understand is that global supply chains are complex, and the legislation doesn't require you to look into tiers 2 and 3. However, the way that we're moving, it doesn't hurt to talk to your tier 1s about your tier 2s and get further down. In terms of the evolving legislation landscape and guidance, as many of you probably know, working in this, I'm assuming you've been part of this in your own companies, seeing how you're in this webinar. The lack of clarity has been challenging, to say the least, and we're actually building the plane as we fly it. So that's why it's important to do what's right for your own company. And much like Bill C-59 right now, there isn't much guidance, and as it develops, we just make sure that we're making our clientele aware. Lack of cooperation from suppliers. We also found that some suppliers who didn't have the resource to engage would simply state, "Look at our ESG report." So at that point, the company has to make a business decision. Okay, do we go further, or do we just take that? Are we protected in our risk assessment of the suppliers that have said, "We don't have the time for this, here's our ESG report," or "Here's our supplier code of conduct"? At that point, does it make sense to continue tracking down that supplier? And we found that to be different companies really approach that differently. And then finally, the resource constraints for due diligence. It's great to say and list all of these things that companies can do, from integrating technology to looking at all of your supply chain. But at the end of the day, what makes sense for you as a company, and what's pragmatic for those that don't have the resource? My next slide here kind of looks at a best practice piece that we've certainly developed and seen through one, now that we've seen the hundreds of reports that have come through, and we've went through hundreds of reports to get an idea of what the best practice is. I feel bad for one of our staff members that has done this, because his name is Kai, he's on the call. He's certainly probably eye-tired from this, but what's really important is a pre-assessment. Once we sit down and identify what suppliers are going to be in this assessment pool, let's run it through a pre-assessment based on industry risk, geography risk, and product risk. From there, you can identify those for more formal assessment, and that really helps you manage the number of suppliers that you're actually going to be connecting with. It should get you some confidence around your numbers that you're looking at. The idea of integrating modern slavery considerations to your supplier contracts, we found that many companies do not do this. We found that many companies don't even have a supplier code of conduct. So Carmen will get into the governance behind this, but what's really important is to somehow integrate considerations to your procurement processes. And if you don't have it, don't worry, you're not alone. I think of the 20 companies we work with, I think we've worked with 15 on setting up governance systems. Engaging suppliers throughout the process before you actually reach out to a supplier to understand what they're doing to address child and slave labor in their supply chain. Reach out to them before that. Make sure that they have an understanding that, hey, in 2 days, we're going to reach out to you with an online dashboard survey for you that'll take 3 minutes to fill in. It helps us as a company meet our obligations against the act. Don't just table drop it onto your supply chain. It's important that you give them a heads up and work with them throughout it. There's collaborating with industry peers and multi-stakeholder groups. I think this is really important. You all have a network, and you all have a colleague down the road at another company that you can talk to. In Calgary, there's Esli, Marie Jutrovich I'm not sure if Marie's on the call here, but she's done a great job at setting up a formal meeting, a monthly meeting of dozens and dozens, maybe even 100 sustainability practitioners, the Energy Sector Sustainability Leadership Initiative. And I suggest you take advantage of those forums where you can talk to what other companies are doing. Leveraging technology, we'll get into that later, but we've certainly found that the ability to use technology to map your supply chain and conduct your risk assessment, all the while tracking in an auditable format, is incredibly important. We partnered with Position Green from Norway to develop a software program that helps you do that. And we'll get into that a bit later too. And this last bullet is not a plug for us, but I think it's incredibly important. No different than how you would assure your ESG report or your financial statements, is engage a third party. Doesn't have to be shift critical, but engage someone externally for that independent risk assessment, just so that you can make sure that the data is somewhat verifiable. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carmen, and she can walk you through some governance framework and design considerations. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Craig. And good morning, everyone on the West Coast, and good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast. So we're going to be looking at the governance frameworks. What does best practice look like? So what are some of the leading companies in this space doing that we've seen, the overall general trend? But we also want to break it down and make it tangible for you, so you can, at the end of the day, you can take something, one thing that you can take away and apply it to your own organization. And then I'm going to be sure to give you an example, so to help illustrate the point. So when we talk about governance models and design for applying to the Act, we're really looking at organizations that are creating oversight specifically on child labor and forced labor considerations. So that means at the very highest level of the organization, we're seeing the board taking accountability. We're seeing them looking at reviewing risks through their board process, incidents, and then we're also looking at training the board on the elements of the Act. Companies may, especially in the resource sector, may have already started to do this in the human rights space. And so child labor and modern slavery would be a part of that as well. And so once we have board level oversight, companies are also starting to appoint senior executive level responsibility for then implementing the oversight from the board. So whether it's policy development, processes and risk management, and then reporting, it's giving the senior executives who are appointed to lead this work, and then running with it and implementing it in the organizations and their departments. What we're seeing is that there may be cross-department oversight, so it may not just be one department like the sustainability department or the supply chain department, but a number of them that actually have some level of play here. So they need to be working together if that is the case for your own organization. So we may see it live in health and safety, environment and community department, sustainability, legal department, supply chain, and even human resources may have a play in as well. But I think the takeaway here is that it does tend to be a senior executive who has overall oversight of this issue. And so let's look at how companies are developing policies to prevent and mitigate forced labor and child labor, and how they're integrating this into existing policies. So again, we're seeing companies starting to do a number of different integrate this issue into different policies that may already exist. So let's say a company may have a sustainability or health and safety and environment and community policy. It may already exist in the code of ethics, but they're using explicit language from the Act, and they're integrating that into the policy. They may also have a standalone human rights policy, especially if you're coming from an industry where it's a higher impact industry that's more closely linked to the issue. Then you may have a separate human rights policy, as well as we're seeing companies have specific, explicit supplier codes of conduct or supplier expectations so that they can communicate what is expected of the suppliers, and then develop a mechanism around this for ensuring that suppliers then sign off and agree to the expectations. So it's kind of like the entry point to what is expected and then who has signed off, and that then leads to the due diligence and assessing the risk. And so I'm going to speak a little bit more of the supplier expectations and how this is how you can capture the elements of the Act into your supplier expectations. And so again, the question is, have you communicated these expectations to your suppliers? Have they acknowledged it, your policies, and have they signed off? And then do you have a process to do that? One thing I do want to give an example of what are we finding in these supplier expectations or the supplier code of conduct specifically for the Act. So what we're seeing from, and Tech Resources gives a good example of this, but how they're integrating elements of the Act into their supplier expectations and what that looks like. So it may be incorporating, asking suppliers to have mechanisms to verify the ages of employees and contractors, for example. It may be requiring them to mandate appropriate safeguards for anyone aged 18 and younger that works for the supplier. Another example is requiring employee contracts to be in writing, and that all employees maintain control of their own identification documents like passports and so on. So those are common examples of what you may find in some of these supplier codes of conduct or expectations. All that to be said, I just want to reiterate here that policies are well and good, but they don't work unless you support them with training for your staff. So it's really important that you have a process to train your employees on what is the Act, what are the elements of the Act, why is it important, and why are we monitoring this, and why are we doing it today? So moving on to evaluating suppliers and conducting due diligence in alignment with supplier expectations. So how do we actually then conduct the due diligence that the policies help us set up? I'm going to just give an example of what I've seen. And so this is I'm from the mining space, and I'm going to use the example from Lundin Mining. They're not a client of mine, but this is all from their modern slavery Act report that they filed. It's publicly available, and I thought it was a really good outline of how they're conducting due diligence. And so what I saw them doing was creating governance and systems on due diligence around 5 areas. And the first one was around how they conduct due diligence is they conduct human rights risks and impact assessments. And this is a key way on how they're identifying risks in this area. So the human rights risk and impact assessments are already being done. And it's a way for them to pick up on identifying the risks that may already be there. The second way is that they're doing due diligence is also through supplier onboarding. So one is, again, signing off on the supplier expectations. They may be doing screening, pre-screening, doing background checks of suppliers to ensure that there haven't already been flags raised or incidents of child labor found before. And they may have questionnaires where they can integrate pieces of the Act into those questionnaires and see, evaluate the responses that they get, and then again doing background checks. The third way that they may be conducting due diligence is through the compliance program that they already have. So this is after you've signed your suppliers on, then you're going and you're checking through the compliance program on are they doing what they said they were doing, especially are they aligning with the elements of our supplier expectations that we're requiring them to. And then the fourth way that we're seeing them apply due diligence is through grievance mechanisms. So they may have grievance mechanisms in place at their sites and as well as in communities, which allow community members and employees and contractors to raise any concerns or any incidents that they may have identified. And then the last way is through the whistleblower program that they have established. So this is through, for directors, employees, consultants, communities who can report violations against the code of conduct, which includes human rights issues such as the child and forced labor. So with that, I'm going to pass it on, I think, to Frank. Oh, I'll just go back one slide. Sorry about that. This is just to say that with all of that, the governance is about creating also not just oversight, but the systems and how you manage the issues. And so Shift Critical's Modern Slavery Risk Tool definitely addresses all of that. And then it aligns with what you'll see with a typical management framework. And I believe Frank's going to touch on this later on in the presentation.
Great. And I'll jump in here actually, and I'll pass to Frank right after the risk assessment section. And I think that's a great point that you bring up, Carmen, as well, because peer best practice and peer review is so important. And I would just suggest to everybody, along with having your local support network, is look at the reports that are out there. We're happy to help with that too. It's not a sales job, but get on it and search the database and see what is best practice. And Lundin Mining certainly has that. The first stop on a risk assessment slide, I have 3 slides here to discuss what we're doing, and then I'll jump to Frank quickly because the really important part of this is training. But what we've done at Shift Critical is that we've mapped the globe with respect to forced labor and child labor using 5 sources. We have a numerical sliding scale. And the Coles Note version, at the end of it, you come out with a low risk, medium risk, high risk, and severe risk. There's a lot of input that goes into identifying the risk across the globe. But this gives you an idea of how the risk assessment that we proposed with our clients that we work with use it. Again, we in partnership with Position Green. On the front end, you put in your supplier information, quick survey. On the back end, it kicks out a risk ranking, and it's based off of geography, industry, and product. So the best practice for risk assessment that we found, it's, again, we spoke about a risk-based approach. It's identifying and prioritizing what that risk looks like for your company. Risk assessments are certainly about due diligence. And while the regulation itself is a disclosure regulation, so at the far end of the tangent, you could be compliant just by sending in a report that doesn't say anything, as long as you submit a report. However, and I think Frank will speak to this, as the legislation continues to evolve, this could emerge into the similar to what France and Germany are doing, where they focus on requirements around due diligence. One aspect is providing all information on potential risk. And through this first process, we did find actual indications of child labor and slave labor. And it's making sure that when you identify that, how are you going to approach it? And I think it's important to have that human rights experience, not only on identifying the issue when it occurs, but how do you remediate? So it's very important to be very transparent on that. One of the best practices we found as we did the review of the hundreds of the reports that are out there right now is don't be vague on how the risk assessment tool is, or how your risk assessment process went. We found a lot of companies have approached it as a communications exercise, and risk assessment is anything but that. So I think it would serve you well to be as transparent as possible in delineating your methodology that you used, even if it's only a paragraph, but be specific. We did speak earlier on breaking down suppliers by spend and supplier share with respect to internal budget. And I think that's an important one that helps you take a manageable approach. One client we have literally has well over 10,000 suppliers, and we were able to, through a pre-assessment and then the assessment itself, based on certain priorities in terms of supplier spend and share, we're able to bite-size it down, and then we'll continue with another section of their supply chain next year. So there's ways to do this more manageably. And then technology, again, it's getting off spreadsheets. And I understand not every company has the resource to do this, But as this gets more stringent, we're going to see that technology is indeed going to play a role, particularly on the audit side. If in fact in 2028, your company gets audited by the government of Canada, the Quorum Bugs person, you can, rather than send over spreadsheets that you may or may not have lost, being able to have it all housed in one dashboard is significant.
Craig, just one quick comment to what you just shared there, and I thought it was just brilliant around, don't be vague about your methodology, and one of the best practice or good practice that we see from our member companies too is to also share this. Like, although you're going to make your report available publicly on your website, to drive that compliance and that expectation down into the supply chain, certainly spend the time to share the methodology with your supply chain partners as well, right? And to the extent that you're sharing them with them around how you're addressing this risk and your methodology, it's going to help them drive their program as well, and they can actually provide feedback to you as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a great point, Alan. And actually, this next slide is maybe an important point for your membership. Is again back to the resource. Not every company has the ability to hit the best practice. So do the best you can, and that is in the spirit of the Act. Not everybody needs to adopt artificial intelligence and technology. If it's working for you on the spreadsheet, stay on the spreadsheet, just do that. But our approach, and I really encourage people to our partner Position Green, who we've worked with on the software development. Check them out. They're a great partner company of ours. And through our partnership, our risk assessment tool and technology is able to hit all of these points, and it's inexpensive. And it allows you to sleep at night. It allows you to map your supply chain and trace it. The data collection is impeccable in terms of in 5 years down the road, you can look back and see your 2024 analytics. The risk identification is there. And the audit function is so important. And then I think the expertise of Frank and I that we have, and I don't mean for this to sound like a sales pitch, but we are very good at human rights. Both of us have been working in human rights risk assessment and engagement for 50 years between the two of us. The remediation bit, we are able to help with the remediation side, and it's something that we've been doing for a long time. But if you can take that step onto a software that can also tie into your ESG reporting software, I think these are ways that companies are going to be moving towards to help this entire process. And I believe that's the end of my section here, and I'll pass it over to Frank to have a discussion on staff training.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks to all the other speakers this morning, Carmen and Alan. And thank you all for being here with us this morning. It's an interesting time. I just want to say a couple of things before we start. During this section, I'm going to be talking about two things. First, I'm going to be talking about training, and I'm going to use it as an example, the training that we provide. And I'm going to provide you with a background and some reasons as to why we think it is important that you train people with respect to forced and child labor, to cover off some of your obligations under the Act. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later on about trends that we're seeing and things that you've heard about, things we've seen in the last year. We're going to move on to look at some trends and things that we imagine will change over time with the Act. So I'm going to introduce our training course, but I also wanted to say something firstly to call to your attention the fact that we do have a partnership with Supply Chain Canada, and we're very proud of that, and we're very happy to be working with Alan and all of his people. And they will be offering our training not only through their site and their programs, but also, of course, we offer the training on our website, and you can find a link to that on our website, and you'll come across things on LinkedIn, and et cetera, et cetera. So why do we train people, and why do we recommend that training is an important due diligence measure? Well, the Act says under Section 11, I believe it is, that the entity, a company, has to show the steps it's taken during its previous financial year to prevent and reduce the risk that forced or child labour are used at any step of the production of goods in Canada or elsewhere. It also says the entity should report on how it assesses its effectiveness that forced and child labour are not being used in its business and supply chain. So the Act is intended to drive risk mitigation, risk assessment and risk mitigation. And as Craig rightly said, currently it's a disclosure. You can, not recommended, but you can simply say, you know, we haven't taken any risk assessment measures. Thank you. We've complied with our obligations under the Act. However, that's not recommended. The Act is obviously designed to identify, measure, evaluate, and respond to and report on the risk of forced and child labour. So what most companies do, or many companies do, is implement policy and practice. And all of that, if it's to be implemented correctly, requires knowledgeable staff. If you train your people, it also sends a very strong signal to others that you work with, whether you're a client company or a supplier. It sends a very strong signal that you're serious about it and that your people are knowledgeable. And, you know, the last point I wanted to make here with respect to why we train people is it's a very pragmatic step. You know, the Act actually asks entities to disclose any training that has been conducted with staff, etc., or leadership or leadership. So this is an easy due diligence win, if you like. So next slide. So who do you train? So we've talked a little bit about why we train people. Who do you train? Well, you can read this yourself. Any staff member involved in supply chain recruiting, sourcing, managing, buying, and other aspects of supply chain management who are the first line, if you like, the front line for an organization in dealing with and identifying forced and child labor risk. Of course, executive team and board, you know, the board has oversight. The executive team has responsibility for implementing any measures. The board has oversight and must sign off on the report. So it's crucial that board members understand what forced and child labour are about, what the signs of forced and child labour are, etc., so that they can hand on heart sign off on any report that's produced by the entity. Other functions that have a role or any kind of interaction with supply chain through various means. Accounting, for example, legal, of course, the ESG team, and others, communications. All of these functional roles need to have some understanding of forced and child labour and the risks involved. And of course, not everybody has to be trained to the same level. They're the rudimentary, the sort of fundamentals, and we'll come on to this in a minute. And then for those supply chain professionals who are kind of working at the coalface, to use a mining analogy, they need to probably have a higher level of understanding and knowledge around the risk. And, you know, also suppliers. In some cases, our client companies are working with their own suppliers, and you may be a large supplier, you know, that has an extensive supply chain of your own. And for those key suppliers, we're finding that some of our clients are wanting to work with their suppliers to ensure that they are knowledgeable about circumstances and risk under which the circumstances under which forced and child labour occur and the risks that go with them. So, you know, from our perspective, and I think this is something, you know, I invite Craig or Carmen to jump in here. We believe there's a lack of recognition with respect to how easily, sorry, I'll rephrase that, the low-hanging fruit that training represents. It's a very easy way of, you know, fulfilling some of your due diligence obligations. And it doesn't seem to have landed with a whole lot of companies yet, because we do have some client companies that are training people, but not all. And obviously, we see this as a very easy win. So I'll just talk a little bit about the training that we offer. And our suite of products consist of the things that you can see here on the slide. We think that our product is very flexible, and I don't mean to use this as a sales pitch, because that's not the purpose here. There are other training platforms out there, but we believe that ours is extremely comprehensive, and a lot of work has gone into ensuring that it helps you meet your obligations under the Act and to effectively train your people. So our program it can be online, it can be integrated to learning management systems, LMSs for those companies that have them, and it can be delivered in person. We have both preliminary and advanced modules, and as I said earlier, it's sort of horses for courses. Different people require different levels of training in organizations. It can be provided individually, and so the online, we operate through a platform called Thinkific, and you can go in and you can sort of sign up for that for the first 2 modules anyway. And then we have individual, group, and enterprise versions, and these, again, as I say, they can be delivered online or through in-person training. And we would recommend, in most cases where you're looking to train your board and executive, the better option is generally to have in-person training, if the resources are available to do that, because boards particularly tend to have very specific questions which relate to their obligations and their fiduciary duties, with respect to the report and signing off on that report. And we don't generally fill a sort of a training package with those kinds of answers, because they're very specific and very geared towards helping the board to fulfill its obligations. And as I said earlier, we're partnered with Supply Chain Canada to offer our training. So next slide, please. So we have our preliminary modules. I mentioned these already. Each of these are about 10 to 15 minutes long. And in the first modules 1 and 2, delivered online, we provide definitions of forced and child labour. We talk about what the Act says and about the obligations of entities in responding to the Act. We talk about how to identify forced labour and child labour. What are the red flags? And we talk a bit about an organization's processes and how to report to meet the obligations that are specified under the Act. So those are preliminary modules, and then we have advanced modules, which are most often delivered in person. And we talk a bit about what Carmen has spoken to earlier on, governance and continuous improvement. So what sort of governance system works around managing your supply chain risk, your modern slavery supply chain risk, and it's different for different companies. Clearly, if you're a smaller supplier, you would not be expected to have necessarily the extensive functional roles around managing this risk as you would expect to see for a very large company such as Shell, or one of these giants like Microsoft, or again, different entities will have different requirements and they can meet their needs in different ways. The advanced modules also talk about risk assessment. Craig has already covered that. And we talk about due diligence. Due diligence is the more extensive framework that you build around identifying your risk, categorizing it, and then responding to it. And generally that involves, particularly for companies that identify a risk either in their own operations or in their supply chain, building a management framework. Now, companies, particularly in the industries that we work with mostly, such as the energy and mining industries, you know, they're very adept at building management frameworks. They do it for health and safety. They do it for a whole bunch of things. So building a management framework, and all I mean by that is building a structure so that you can consistently measure, map, and respond to the risks that you identify. And that's everything. And I'll talk a little bit more. I won't go into any more detail on that here. I'll talk to it in a little while in greater detail. So,
Frank, just jump in here, Frank. Alan, I just want to get a time check from you. How are we doing? Just as Frank brings us home. We happy?
Take myself off mute there. I think we're doing really good for time, and we'll be able to provide a decent amount of time in the back end for some Q&A. So far, so good, guys. Okay.
Well, back to you, Frank.
You shouldn't have said that, Alan. I'll be blathering on until Thursday.
I'll make sure to keep you moving.
Just keep an eye on our participants so that we don't see any eyes rolling back in heads. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit, and I'll be brief here, all jokes aside. Future outlook. Clearly, the Act already creates mandatory obligations to report on risk assessment, the measures that entities have taken. And as we said, even if none have been undertaken, you're still obliged, if you're covered by the Act, you're still obliged to report. What we've seen so far is that there is, in the first year anyway, leniency for deficiencies in reporting, but there's not leniency for a failure to comply. Now, what the punitive measures look like over the next couple of years, you know, obviously the Act allows for fines and other punitive measures, including, you know, up to and including seizing documents, putting someone in a position of oversight in a company, you know, through the ombudsperson's office, etc. So there are punitive measures. Not sure how these will be enacted over the next couple of years, but guaranteed that if the government sees a very poor compliance rate, then it's going to be a response. So at the moment, boards confirm that risk is accurately assessed for reporting purposes, but compliance measures are likely to be more demanding in the future, and we're seeing that in other jurisdictions, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And lastly, again, there are some really straightforward measures that can generate very easy wins here. Third-party oversight is one. Generates trust, and you know, generates a sense that, you know, the assessment is independent, a risk assessment. Just undertaking a risk assessment, a really easy win, particularly if you're using an online platform and an assessment tool such as the type that we offer, and then training. This is you know, an easy due diligence measure which helps you fulfill requirements. And then let's look at future state. Well, it's a moving landscape. You know, we really only have the corollaries of looking at other jurisdictions and seeing what's unfolding there, and then you know, anticipating that we will see similar things in Canada. So there is the potential for increased litigation and punitive consequences. Let's remember that the reports that entities produce are public. They can be accessed by anyone. And now with Bill C-59 in play, the amendments to the Competition Act, it's possible for a citizen to bring a request for review by the Competition Bureau of statements around environment and social claims that entities make. So no doubt that particularly if you're a company with a risk profile already, and you know, you identify risk in your supply chain or in your operations, and you report on that, for sure, you know, civil society organizations are going to be looking at those reports, and we could see punitive consequences and increased litigation. Again, related to that, we've seen in other jurisdictions, particularly Australia again, more stakeholder activism, name and shame campaigns, for example, and up to divestment. If we look, for example, in the UK, the Norway government pension plan divested from a UK security company, G4S, in 2019 due to risk of human rights violations in the Middle East amongst its workforce. So, there are lots of risks, reputational risks and other types of risk associated with the Act and non-compliance and, future trends, the way the Act may be modified going forward. We think you're going to see a change from just a reliance on reporting on risk assessment to a change to looking at mandatory due diligence. So mandatory due diligence will be all of the other pieces of the puzzle that are involved in having an effective management framework. We see, in Australia recently, and in fact, I think this year, January of this year, they've just made changes to their Act. The recommendations, well, one of them is going through that they have a commissioner, and they've said that the Australian government has set aside funding for a commissioner's office, significant funding to have oversight of compliance with the Act. And there are other measures on the board, one of which is mandatory due diligence, rather than just mandatory reporting, but mandatory due diligence and risk assessment. We're going to see greater reliance on technology. Not only are the organizations covered by the Act going to be using these technologies, and it's everything from blockchain, AI, and online platforms of all sorts to analyze their risk, but also at the other side of the coin, I think we're going to see from civil society organizations a mirroring of this and a similar use of technology to analyze the reports that are produced, because, as I say, they are public. And so we're going to see the application of technology to the analysis of these reports, and then the comparison between what's written and what's actually happening from other data sources, information derived from other data sources. And this could provision civil society organizations and individuals to bring claims against companies if they feel that these are exaggerated or green or greenwashing of some sort. There'll be more attention going forward, as we're seeing, to assessing the effectiveness of actions taken, because ultimately an Act like this is meant to have impact, and it's about the impact of the measures taken. So we think we're going to see more attention to assessing effectiveness. And at the moment, there is a question in the reporting, the list of things that one reports against, there is a question about assessing effectiveness. We think we're going to see more attention to that in the future. We're going to see more demand from customers, people voting with their wallets. And we may see mandatory training. So we've been talking about training a little earlier on. We may see a switch to training being made mandatory under the Act. And there are several other measures which we don't have time to go into right now. So I just wanted to go back and very briefly to a slide that Carmen showed earlier on. And this speaks to the management framework. As I said, entities are very adept at building management frameworks to manage risk and then handle that risk going forward, and to do it in a consistent way. And it involves developing policy. And for most companies, this would be a supplier code of conduct. And we've done many of those in the last year for different organizations. Developing systems and processes, conducting a supply chain risk assessment, then taking action to mitigate any impacts and adopt appropriate practices. And this is all about being consistent. When you want to manage risk, you have to be consistent. You have to build the right structure within your organization to allow that to happen on an ongoing basis. Remediation, if required, and this again is part of the Act. It asks, have you taken any remediation measures? Part of that is adopting grievance mechanism. I think Carmen spoke to that earlier on. Tracking performance and introducing metrics so that you can measure your performance. Reporting and communicating. There is, of course, the mandatory report to government and the questionnaire, and then communicating on your website to shareholders and other stakeholders. Really, this I guess this diagram should be, turned by a few degrees clockwise, because that implementing a governance structure is the essential beginning to establishing a management framework. So, okay, I will leave it there, and I'll hand you back to Alan, who's gonna finish off here.
Yeah, before I jump into, we have a couple of questions so far in the Q&A. I've answered a couple of questions as well, but I would invite all of our participants, any questions for our presenters today, please enter them into the Q&A functionality, and we'll then move and try to address all of the questions as best we can. Craig, maybe if we can just jump to the next slide, and I'll touch on this briefly, just to, springboard from Frank's mention of the importance of training there. So as Frank has indicated, we partnered with Shift Critical to provide an online course. So it's entitled Canada's Modern Slavery Act Explained, and this is an online course available to all of our members at a reduced discounted membership pricing. And so stay tuned for this here. We're going to launch it in hopefully a week's time and make that available, and you can access it in a number of ways, but definitely the link from our national website will take you there as well. And it's interesting because in the early days of this act, it was amazing the number of companies that sort of called our office seeking guidance and input. And many of those companies were actually moving and reacting to the ask of their customers as well. So many of our members in the manufacturing space, the services space, hearing that this is something that their customer was seeking and asking for as well. And so they were seeking some additional training and whatnot. And so this is where I think there's a tremendous value and benefit in not only providing this training to those within your organization, but also to extend similar training down into your supply chain, certainly your tier one supply chain partners as well, and so that you can create that greater awareness of what the Act actually is. So I think this is the fifth webinar on S211 that we've had this year already. And so tremendous interest on all of this, and we'll continue to sort of produce content and resources for our members. Another item that we did was earlier this year too, we did our first hackathon on modern slavery. And so this is bringing in supply chain participants and others, and getting a really diverse group of people to come together to tackle the problem of eradicating modern slavery from our supply chains. And so I'm pleased to share that report is going to be available. And so this is a report that walks through all of the findings from that particular hackathon and some of the action areas. And so if you would like a copy of this report, please request hackathon report and then send that email to info.ab@supplychaincanada.com. And then finally, as another additional resource too, is coming in fall, we're working with Shift Critical to provide modules 3 and 4, and also sort of the instructor-led training course on, so how do you go about conducting the risk assessment, and what are the mitigation activities that organizations can take as well. And so while the first course, module 1 and 2, is great to share with all employees within an organization, this one dives down and it's a little bit more specific to the needs of those who will be directly involved in the risk assessment and the mitigation type of work, of which many in supply chain would be directed to as well. Okay. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn and take a look at our Q&A. Presenters, I got the first question from Varun. How does this act affect small versus medium versus large companies? There's a lot of research, communication, and responsibility involved with ensuring your supply chain doesn't have forced labor. What should small and medium-sized companies do when they don't have specific persons or department who can do this job full-time?
Sure, maybe I'll jump in there. The spirit of the act, and I hope this is how I start every conversation with our partners. The spirit of the act is do the best you can. And if the best you can is to hit submit on the report, and this is a horrible example, but I'm going to use it. You could find, even if you did this risk assessment, you could find instances all over your supply chain of forced and child labor. As long as you hit submit, your obligation has been fulfilled. So first and foremost, just do the best you can. The things that you can do to make it, if you do not have the resources as a smaller company to jump into a software that helps you manage this, it's work internally, work with your supply chain team, identify, pick a data point that works for you. Whether it's all spend above $500,000, all spend below $500,000, all spent above $1 million, percentage of your supplier spend goes to one organization, you should be able to get it down to anywhere from 10 to 20 companies or to 200 companies. And it's just very important to select the methodology that works for you, train your staff, like Frank was saying, it's the lowest hanging fruit, and then submit the report. And I'll pass on to the other panelists who might have something else to say.
I'll just jump in here. One of the things that you could do to even just start to build alignment around is look for you may have already received questionnaires from current customers who are larger organizations who have started to integrate the act into how they're communicating to their own suppliers. So if that's the case with you, if you've already received questions from your customers, bring that up, look at what they're asking you, and start there, because that's going to be a key driver. If you have not only the government that's requiring it, but also your own customers, that's going to help to create alignment in your own organization.
And
thank you, Carmen.
Just to thanks, Carmen. Just to build on that, I think if you are, just to use for example, if you're an Alberta-based company with a very localized supply chain, and for example, you're looking at the inputs and the products that you're receiving, a very cursory look might indicate to you that you have a relatively low risk supply chain. Of course, if you are receiving supplies from a company that in turn is getting supplies from a high risk location, and there are ways that you can go online and you can look for global risk identification maps, for example, and you can do a sort of a preliminary review of your risk in that way. And then, as Carmen says, issuing some surveys to those where you either don't have information or you suspect there may be a risk, and getting responses based on those answers or those questions you see in the Act, that can go a long way, because what the Act asks you to do is assess your risk. So, I think there is a recognition that not all entities have expertise in this type of risk assessment in-house. So it's about making a start and building on that over time. We at the other end of the spectrum, we see companies with 30,000, 50,000 suppliers. Of course, they in turn cannot survey every one of those suppliers. They have to use filters and all of that sort of thing, as Craig said, based on spend, et cetera, et cetera. So it's back to that, what is doable. I don't think it's necessarily what is right for your company, but what is achievable given the resources that you have at hand. And better to be able to write and say yes, we have done a preliminary risk assessment than just to write in the report, we've done nothing. And then you build that over time.
Thank you, Frank. Those are all great suggestions from both Frank, Carmen, and Craig. Craig, maybe if you can unshare your screen, and that way folks can sort of see our faces instead of that slide, that'll be great. And as a reminder to all of our participants, today we'll be sending out an email after this with a copy of the PDF slides, a link to a recording of this video, and then we'll also provide links to some of the resources that were mentioned in this presentation or in this webinar today as well. I know Amber was asking for a link to the energy companies discussing modern slavery governance, for instance, right? And so Craig and Frank, we can probably add that link over into this email as guidance to those that are here today. I'll move on to our next question from Audra. What are examples that companies have implemented to assess effectiveness in the first year?
Happy to jump in there. I think Frank, you
Go
probably
ahead.
said
Go
you
ahead.
were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
It is early days. So I think what we're going to see is in the next 2 to 3 years, because having the baseline completed for 2024, I think next year we'll be able to see how effective your systems and processes are now in place with the look back, with the benefit of hindsight, as you move into next year's reporting. Because seeing how this was the first year, it's difficult to really put your finger on how effective your process was. And I'll let Frank speak a bit more.
Yeah, I think here you got to bear in mind, firstly, what the Act is about and what that question is trying to get at when it talks about effectiveness. It's not talking about the effectiveness of remediation. It's not talking about all of these other things. It's talking specifically about the effectiveness of the risk assessment measures that you've taken. And let's also bear in mind that the guidance provided by government is very weak on this. Now, if you step into the arena of human rights due diligence, for example, there are clearly lists of things that companies can do to assess risk and then assess how thorough, if you like, that risk assessment is in identifying the target risks. But we're not there yet. You know, as Craig says, you know, when companies have responded to this question, they often list things. You know, the question is how have you assessed your effectiveness? Companies will say things like, well, we trained people and we did this and we did that, and they'll list all of the measures that they took, which really don't give you an insight into how effective those measures are. So I think the key message here is that in the absence of specific guidance, companies are going to have to build metrics over time that will let them, build a database that says, okay, in year X we did this, year zero we did this, and over the next 3 years we've been able to measure that we've done so, and we've seen a trend that we've increased the number of suppliers we've assessed, we've done this, we've done that. And building that database will help companies to be able to say, yes, we think on a scale of 1 to 10, we've been fairly effective in assessing our risk. I just don't think we're there yet. And this is a bunch of information that's going to have to build up over time.
Wonderful. Thanks, Frank.
I'll just add to what Frank said. It's so new that we really haven't seen any guidance on how to measure the effectiveness. Although one thing I have seen is that more so from the UN guiding principles around criteria on measuring the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms. So companies are already, and again, for that, the UNGPs, they are really the standard for how companies can measure risk and impact when it comes to human rights for business. And so they developed criteria for companies to measure the effectiveness of their grievance mechanisms. And again, that's one of the ways that companies are doing due diligence for the Act, but that's only one area, that's only one way. But it's a good way of, you could go there and see how it's being applied in that capacity as an example. But again, this is really, we're going to see more of this evolve as the years go on, but we're not quite there yet. And certainly companies really aren't reporting on how they're measuring effectiveness yet when it applies to the Act.
Thank you, Carmen. There was a question here from Agnes, and I partially answered it, but maybe I'll get all of you to provide your input as well. So her question is there any known feedback on how the federal government is monitoring and auditing the reports submitted by companies for compliance with Bill S211, and what measures are in place to ensure accuracy and accountability in these reports? Now, what I responded in the chat or the Q&A to Agnes are some of the measures that are in place currently, that's already in place to drive and support that transparency and that compliance. Everything from the Act itself, the requirement to attest and approve by the company's governing body and whatnot. But I wanted to get maybe your perspective around. Okay, so all of these reports have been submitted to the government. Have you heard anything from the government around the quality of these reports and whatnot?
No. I'll jump in and then I'll invite everybody else to comment. Again, early days, and I mean the opening question when we reach the sort of deadline for reporting, one of the big questions is, what's going to happen with all this information? To your point, has the government invested in developing the capacity and the competency to do anything with all this information? And I think it's early days. There is funding set aside for capacity building around the Act. And in Australia, as I said earlier, for example, there's a recognition that this is a huge area of uncertainty, and so they've just invested in developing informing an office of the Commissioner of I can't remember what the exact title is now, but it's Commissioner's Office, to look at the reports that come in and to develop a staff and the competency to analyze those reports and then home in on lack of compliance. So we don't have, at least I'm not aware of any feedback to date on how these reports are being analyzed and evaluated. That will change over time.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Frank. We've only got a couple of minutes left here. So one final question, and if you can be brief on your response, and it's a question relating to the bill itself. Are supplier services subject to the bill? So if you are a company providing services, are you subject to the Act, I guess?
Let me jump in on that one. And that depends purely on your company's size. One, whether or not you're a publicly traded company, and two, there's a threshold of 3 different obstacles that would make you an entity under the obligations of the Act. I think if you I look at it differently. I look at it from an operational risk, and I think this also goes back to what Frank was talking about in the previous question on the reporting. How are you making sure reports are good? I think what you're going to see, and we've seen it with clients, for example, for a company that didn't have a sustainability policy, they were kicked out of a PAR process of one of Canada's largest energy companies. They developed a sustainability policy and they were allowed back in to bid on the work. I can see the operational risk for some of these smaller companies that are providing services. If you do not have a policy or some type of governance document that integrates modern slavery work, I think that's the true risk, not whether or not you're actually going to be under the Act, because the Act itself, again, is do the best you can. I think the real risk is operationally in not being able to secure work with a company that's demanding that you have integrated modern slavery work in your policies.
Well said, Craig. Okay, that puts us at the end of our time, and we have successfully answered all of the questions in the Q&A. At this point in time, I want to thank Craig, Carmen, and Frank for your contribution today and sharing your knowledge. I want to thank all of our participants today for investing your time to learn more about the Act. And I encourage all of you to use the resources available from Supply Chain Canada to learn more and to implement a lot of these best practices and changes into your organization as well. On behalf of Supply Chain Canada, thank you for attending today. Have a fantastic day, and I hope that this webinar was extremely helpful and in helping you in your journey. So have a great day, everyone.